Hello, everyone, and welcome to The Intelligent Community, the podcast of the Intelligent Community Forum. We're glad you came home. I'm Zacharilla, a founder of the ICF. You know, despite the pandemic, most intelligent communities remain focused on working through it, identifying what they need to know to continue their digital transformation and applied innovations that tie technology to making community and human life and public health much better. It's what they do best, and it's what we're here to learn from today. But as the world has learned and learned last night again, as it has been experiencing for a long time, really, something else is pushing against the light, which is the community. There has been another epidemic, an epidemic of contempt, anger and division, denials of rights, a coarseness seems to have taken hold in the fabric of our communities. An inability perhaps to see or listen to the other. No vaccine is being pushed into production to help us here. We're stuck right now, and we need to figure this one out. So how do we deal with the deadly fires of anger, vengeance, humiliation, and the kindling of victimhood and historic memory, which seem to be always active? Well, as always, voices rise and with clarity help us look in the right direction. And we saw one the other night, and I would just like to share his voice with you now. So Matt, if you would.
Kenya and almost every African country was birthed by the ending of empire. Our borders were not of our own drawing. They were drawn in the distant colonial metropoles of London, Paris, and Lisbon, with no regard for the ancient nations that they cleaved apart. Today, across the border of every single African country live our countrymen with whom we share deep historical, cultural, and linguistic bonds. At independence, had we chosen to pursue states on the basis of ethnic, racial, or religious homogeneity, we would still be waging bloody wars these many decades later. Instead, we agreed that we would settle for the borders that we inherited, but we would still pursue continental political, economic, and legal integration. Rather than form nations that looked ever backwards into history with a dangerous nostalgia, we chose to look forward to a greatness none of our many nations and peoples had ever known. We chose to follow the rules of the Organization of African Unity and the United Nations Charter, not because our borders satisfied us, but because we wanted something greater, forged in peace. We believe that all states formed from empires that have collapsed or retreated have many peoples in them yearning for integration with peoples in neighboring states. This is normal and understandable. After all, who does not want to be joined to their brethren and to make common purpose with them? However, Kenya rejects such a yearning from being pursued by force. We must complete our recovery from the embers of dead empires in a way that does not plunge us back into new forms of domination and oppression.
For those of you who don't know, that was Martin Kimani. Mr. Kimani is Kenya's ambassador to the United Nations, and he was speaking here in New York 2 nights ago at the United Nations. And I thought that I would share that with you. We've resolved conflicts before, and that is certainly the news that I want to bring to you. And I have 2 more people, amazing people, who will help us move in that right direction and identify that roadmap that Mayor Bowman spoke about. I was really, really happy when our first 2 guests agreed to open our event. Aisha Khan is the CEO of the Canadian Museum of Human Rights, located in the world's most intelligent community, Winnipeg. Ms. Khan is a lawyer, educator, and community leader dedicated to building a culture of human rights. She served as executive director and senior counsel of the Manitoba Human Rights Commission, where she advanced important rights-based initiatives. She has been in her role as CEO of the Canadian Museum for Human Rights since 2020, where she continues engaging people around the world in a growing movement for hope and human rights. And we're just honored and delighted to have her here today. Welcome, Aisha. Stacia George is the director of the Conflict Resolution Program at the Carter Center in Atlanta, here in the United States. Ms. George became director of the program in 2021. Before that, she served as director for West and Central Africa and Haiti at Chemonics International, a global implementer of development assistance. Stacia also served as deputy director for USAID's Office of Transition Initiatives. And importantly for us, she is an expert in conflict management and international development. Her focus is on conflict-affected environments, stabilization, democracy, and community-driven development programming. And we're going to ask her about that now. So I welcome both of you here to the Intelligent Community Forum Smart 21 event.
Thank you for having us. I know Isha's working a bit on connection into the panel. Lou, would you like me to kick off with some initial thoughts in regards to our discussion?
Yeah, I would, Stacy, and thank you so much for doing that. You know, you've been involved in projects around the world that involve intense human conflict, suffering caused when democratic rights and civility are eroded, and the dignity that emerges when we figure out ways to respect one another. And we talked a little about that yesterday. Can I ask you first, you know, based on your depth of experience, how would you describe the current landscape today as it relates to the levels of social, political, and obviously geopolitical conflict? Is this a particularly bad time, or give us some hope here? Do today's challenges fit into a historic or recurring pattern that you look at and say, I've seen this before, and I think I have some tools around this?
Well, I'll say yes and. So I think we're all extremely concerned about some of the dynamics that we're seeing in the world. We have a world where mis and disinformation is a new weapon of war, and information campaigns and strategic communication campaigns are actually one of the most powerful tools to help mitigate conflict, but we're actually losing the ability to utilize those due to mis and disinformation, combined with urbanization in cities and needing to keep up with managing those structures and serving citizens, a variety of citizens and all of their needs, and those stressors combined with climate change, combined with what we're seeing particularly in many of our communities, serious polarization. I can speak from the US. I've never been so concerned in my life. President Carter had generally, worked overseas, had only engaged in the US on mental health issues, never foresaw that we would have to engage on conflict resolution in the US. But it is, there was a decision about a year and a half ago, that the time was required for us to be able to engage in this space. We have serious concerns as we run up to elections. We're dealing with racial injustice issues, political polarization, increased use and purchasing of arms, plus armed movements. It's really, and I think what's also extremely concerning for us is people are just not talking to each other.
Yes.
You have families that are not talking to each other. You have people who just don't want to talk to someone who has a different opinion than them. And what and that is not the way we move forward. The way we move forward is through connections. When you talk about building resilience towards conflict, there's three categories of resilience. I won't bore you with them, but they're basically called bridging, linking, and building capital. And what those are connections with other people in your community, and connections built through listening and understanding others' perceptions. There also is connections built with other communities, other individuals. And then the last is between citizens and institutions. And what I can say is that in the work that I've done, more than 50% of the time, when we look at one of the drivers behind the issues we see, there is a breakdown between leaders and governance and its citizens within communities. And one of the first steps is to rebuild those connections. And so I'll say, Lou, I'm extremely concerned, but there are actually things we can do. And that includes starting to build those connections, creating the ability for people and groups to connect with each other and listen to each other. One of the things we're doing in the US, we're actually building diverse networks across political spectrum, socioeconomic, racial, rural, urban, and bringing them together around a common purpose. And that common norm and purpose is nonviolence and basic democratic principles that everyone can agree on. Like, let's allow people to get into the polling station. Let's not intimidate them with arms. When you can mobilize people around what everyone is for, rather than what people are against each other are, where you're opposing, you're both creating a movement, but also you're creating the space for people to give their, to hear from other sides, to listen and to be more responsive. And I've been so excited by the work we've been seeing in the US now in the states where we're working about, people with very different viewpoints. But what we're doing is we're giving people the skills to have conversations in non-polarizing ways.
Stacia, I'm going to stop you there just because you've given us so much gold to excavate here. I have to ask you, I think you said something, we said a lot of things, but I think you said something that's really, really critical to the communities, which is you try to find that common ground first, not obviously what separates us. We've been very good at talking about what separates us and using that as a wedge. Help me out a little bit. When we talk about bringing these diverse networks, peoples, and so forth together, and you know that they may not always even believe in democratic principles, even though they live in democratic nations. How do you first work through this? How do you drive that level, that ground to work from?
Well, the way you do it is first, you look for people who you know are influencers through different spaces, and you create a very safe space for a smaller group of people to be able to have conversations and say, what do we think we have common ground on? And we really started with, we think we should be able to get everyone to mobilize around, let's not use violence, right? Like, let's find solutions beyond violence. Like, can we just do that? Or can we just mobilize people around no violence around polling stations, for example. So we had a small group of people come together, very diverse, where we talked about that and we said, well, what would be acceptable? What do you think is our common position? And it really comes down, we get down to like the words that are used and the framing of how it's used. And sometimes we have to peel things off and get really, really basic on what we can agree upon, but that's okay. Even if it's the most basic, we're creating the space for people to say, we can agree on this. Even when I'm way over here from you on that, that's okay. We can work together on this piece. And the more you do that, it creates those negotiations and those discussions are really important, even just amongst ourselves, to be able to figure out, like, then how do we facilitate those conversations with larger groups? But the key is having that trusted circle of people that you can build out and have honest conversations and blunt conversations and say, no one's going to like that, or that's just insulting if you frame it like that, who can then reach out to communities once there's an agreement, and people will listen to them and respect them when they say, like, this is something that we can agree on.
Yeah, it would seem to me that that goodwill is something that is part of the currency here. People at some point have to act in goodwill. Mm-hmm. Is that typically the case? Because there must be times when people come to the table that you've set for them and they've got another agenda, which is ultimately to continue to drive through conquest of another territory, taking over some other position in the government, whatever it happens to be. How do you determine if someone is actually functioning with goodwill?
Perfect.
Thanks.
You're welcome. See, I still got it.
Thank you.
I would say that the way that you determine that is, and I'm going to be a little controversial right now.
Please.
I would love for goodwill to be a mobilizing factor around people, but human nature is driven by personal interest, and that's both human psychology, that's like wired in our brain, as well as social psychology.
Yes.
So what it is it may, sometimes I go to the table, I'm like, you don't have to be coming at this from goodwill. What I'm doing is I'm presenting this to you why it's in your interest to do this. You know, if I'm presenting to people, you may not even fully agree with this principle of what I'm saying, but if I'm telling you that you'll get elected if you stand by this, if you, for example, if you're working with elections officials, right? They may not agree to the principle themselves, but if they know that that is like, if you do this and you come on board and work with us on this, this will actually be to your personal benefit. Or you have to, I think what one of the challenges when we work on these issues, and also why we get driven so far apart, is because we're talking to others rather than listening to others, understanding their perspectives, and actually thinking about, if I was in their shoes, why would I want to do this? Why would this matter to me? And actually framing up something that it's in their interest to do it.
Right.
Goodwill is a bonus.
Yeah, and listening is essential to this. And everyone that I've spoken with, you know, who has your level of expertise and successes, that is really a critical point. It's why we invited a psychologist to come on later today too, because they're very good at that. Well, thank you, Stacia. Aisha, you're with us. You made it.
I made it. I've been listening. You just couldn't see me listening.
Oh, good. See, you're a good listener. My father used to say there's a reason you were made with 2 ears and 1 mouth. It's because the Creator wants you to listen twice as hard. Well, listen, we just heard, that, well, you heard some of it. I want to ask you, from your experience, to also give us sort of a snapshot of the current landscape today as it relates to some of conflict. I'm going to ask you the same question I asked Stacia. Is this a particularly bad time? Or from the perspective of the Canadian Museum of Human Rights, do you see something recurring here? Do you see another cycle in motion?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think I'm going to echo a lot of what Stacia just said. So first of all, thanks for your patience in letting me join this call.
We couldn't wait.
I'm speaking to you from Winnipeg, so I'm here in Treaty 1 territory. So that's the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, the Cree, the Ojibwe, the Dene, and Dakota people. We've got water here in Winnipeg that's sourced from Shoal Lake 40 First Nation. And I start this conversation with that acknowledgement because we're talking about listening. We're talking about connection, relationship to people, but also to land. And you mentioned the Creator. So I start there because that's how we start.
Thank you.
That's right. That's how we think about how we're going to work together. And we're talking about community today. Where's the landscape? So from where I sit, and we're in a tough spot, right? People are pressed. People are afraid. It feels like our foundations are a bit destabilized. And I was thinking about it, particularly because of the pandemic, international news today about what's going on in Ukraine, all of the things going on in the world, and thinking it's interesting that Western democracies are pressed in a way that we haven't, at least in my lifetime, haven't felt that shift before, right? That there's something unstable. We feel division, and we've read about it in history books. I work in a museum, so there's always this look back at our history and identity, but we're feeling it during this pandemic in a way I think that many of us haven't felt before. So there's government influence. In many of our Western countries, we haven't thought about that influence, what that looks like, or we take it for granted and now it's in a different way. So we're pressed on what do our rights mean? Who are we? I also think there's a couple of other things in our landscape that are a little bit different. Youth are more engaged, I think, in questions of identity than ever before. They're looking back and pushing us to say we should do better, we need to be better, which, and not to undermine what the movements that youth have brought for centuries, but there's something special. And, that adds to, you're going to have other conversations about digital and media, right? And then I think there's also this, there's a platform for division that we've created. Like, we're able to talk about it, but potentially because our social movements have given us voice, those underrepresented groups that didn't have a voice now have it. So then what? So now we're all talking, and division is amplified, or it's in front of us. So that's kind of big picture what I think of our landscape. I see Stacia nodding. I think we're all saying the same thing, right? Yeah. And do I think there's a cycle? I don't know. I don't think anything happening is all that new. It feels new because it's new to us, and we don't have the benefit of our forefathers and ancestors telling us this is what it felt like. We just take what we can from what we saw them do and go through. So I don't know the answer to that one.
No, and I think the beauty of your work actually is that it's creative enough to try to always identify new tools, as Stacia said, about how to find common ground in times when we are floundering, when we are absolutely, we free people, lost. I mean, I'm going to stay with you, Aisha, and then I'm going to go back to Stacia. But are there tools that that you have been able to identify, say, recently over the last 5 years, that look at the conflicts, look at some of the amplification of the citizen, as Tom Friedman called it once, the amplified citizen, and says, I think these new tools, or these tools that have been combined from things that have worked in the past, are going to be effective?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. In the work that I've done around human rights, conflict, and resolution, now in a different way through educating people about rights at the museum, I think it comes down to that concept of connection, right? So Stacia, you talked about it as common ground. I might talk about it similarly as connection or relation or relationship. And so what I have seen works, and I don't think this is new at all, actually. I think we just forget about it sometimes. When you can relate, when you find something you can relate to as two humans, let's use, and then you apply it to bigger and bigger groups of people, you create empathy, right? You create feeling, you create empathy, and then you're able to listen a little bit because you think that that person mirrors something that you have inside of you. I mean, we see it whenever there's social strife or political strife in the world. Oh my goodness, the GoFundMe goes wild when it's something, I have kids, that happened to my neighbor. And so it's just finding connection. Right. And I think what I've seen, if I think about if I think about conflicts, particularly about issues of discrimination or racism and those kinds of things that really touch who you are at your core, what I've seen happen amongst people in order to find that connection is it often starts with, anger and fear. They both require armor, right? Whatever the feeling is, they both require this armor. When you have the armor, you can't find connection because you're inside. So ways of getting that tool to get in there is sometimes just what we talked about, listening, that acknowledgement that I'm scared too. I may be the oppressor, but there's something that still feels like fear, validated or not, it's still there. Right. And so I think that is that connection building tool, is just finding a way to relate. And it's empathy, or we call it as many different words. But. Yeah,
and again, that's a very deep human value, and something you have to almost be nurtured with in your community. Stacia, just sort of picking up on that, I assume you would agree. But Aisha, also relates how sort of fragmented we're allowed to be. We can have many different types of tribes You can have dark tribes, enlightened tribes, whatever it is that have these common sets of belief, and social media reinforces it. That environment's probably not going to go away. And so how do you establish the kind of safe space or empathy when you've got, all of these different pieces out there, the sort of psychic balkanization operating in the political structure of a society?
Oh, a very, very challenging question.
Yeah, not exactly a softball. I'm sorry.
Yeah, we're all working hard to test different ways to find solutions, and there's not one answer, right? I think that's the thing, is there's a couple of different facets. There's everything from what is your enabling environment for people to be open to listening, which can be everything from, or open to learning, and that can be anything from as basic as digital literacy and media literacy training, which one of the things we're building is adult literacy, media literacy training, digital literacy training, and because there's actually a big gap in it. So that's one, to help people make their own decisions about what they're reading and thinking and saying. The second is create the social conditions or the environment for people to come together and be able to share what they're thinking. And the third is to create the conditions for people to be listening, so it's constructive. So for example, you really have to lay some ground rules for some of these conversations, because if not done well, they can actually be damaging, right? If people are coming in with like, I just want to convince the other person that I'm right, what you're trying to do is actually say, you're coming in to share your perspective and to hear the other one. And it's not for anyone to decide whether the other perspective is right or wrong. There's no right or, there sometimes is a pretty straightforward, like, truth or not, but everyone's allowed their perspective. And just need to respect that they came to that perspective from one way or another. So why are we there? And I think one of the things that's really important is all these methods and tools and ways you go about doing it just really need to be catered to that particular context. I mean, we've talked a lot, in some places, we don't bring together people with opposing viewpoints until actually they can discuss these issues amongst themselves with people who are more like-minded, because in some ways people need to kind of vent how they're feeling and thinking. And also think about how they're talking about those issues and help them to get into a space where they can have a constructive conversation. And I think there's so much push sometimes to first bring together people that are opposing, and that is an ultimate goal, is to get to the listening, but we need to really make sure we're setting people up for success and with the right skills for that. I think one of the things that can be very helpful and is not necessarily good, but is, you really start to see change when you see exhaustion with the status quo. And so this is what I think you see in a lot of communities, is people are like, I don't want to live like this. I don't even want to look at the news. I don't want to talk about 99% of things with the people around me anymore, or I'm just not talking to people at all. But that's not like human nature. Human nature wants to be connected. It's a survival skill. So I just hear a lot, people are afraid and exhausted, and that common feeling is actually the common ground we bring people together around. Like, you're exhausted and afraid, I'm exhausted and afraid. Right. Let's talk about what that means for that. And I think, Deborah put a comment in the chat about you may just be bringing people around the table in regards to their common, their individual interests, but then you have to have people grab on. I agree with that. But it's all about, how do you get the entryway? You get people at the table, but it requires maintenance to make sure you're then using that forum to get people to truly listen and start to not just listen to the other side, but feel it.
Yeah, and coming together, as you say, or as Aisha said, in an empathetic way, and saying, Jesus, I'm exhausted, and I'm sick of this shit too. That's it. Okay, let's have a conversation. Maybe that is a great place to start. It's where my uncles used to start talking sometimes. And I'm going to just stay with Stacia with this idea of the community. At ICF, we say there is no place like home. It sounds like a cliche to some, but communities are where people live their lives. It's where they must be in some type of dialogue with each other, or else the garbage isn't going to get picked up, for goodness sake. So, and I know you work with cities. You have a Cities as a System program. Can you share with us, and then I'm going to ask Aisha the same question, what constructive role do communities play toward building a more civil and stable dialogue? Is there something our network of cities can learn? Because you referred to cities in your opening remarks.
Yeah, I think I truly believe that cities, and a city can be big or it can be a small community. I kind of have a broad definition, but I truly believe that cities more and more are kind of the unit of analysis that we need to be looking a lot more at. Frequently, you'll look at a whole country, but we all know that things are also very regional, but it really comes down to those dynamics within an individual city or community. And that's also where we see a lot of the future of challenges. And my old boss, Dave Kilcullen, he was very premonitory, and many years ago, he wrote a book called Out of the Mountains, where he talked about the future of cities and conflict and how we needed to be paying attention and preparing our cities to address that. And I highly recommend it to people. But
what is it again, Stacia? Just so
Out of the Mountains is the name of the title, by David Kilcullen. And he talks about how, and some of the work I've done is everything linked to, can we get, depending on where you're from, the local Ministry of Water officials, can they be meeting with community members and just talk about how are things going with services? Are they getting feedback from their communities? It's not just community, that doesn't just connect the institution and the community, it connects the people who serve in those roles as well. And I think what's happened, and I've served in government, it can be challenging, and for sure, particularly when you're doing that outreach,
right.
And you're like, I'm going to go into this meeting and they're going to tell me 3,000 things I'm doing wrong, but you have to do it, because in some way you need that venting and that feedback in order to best understand how to serve. And honestly, citizens really, and community members, it creates a community together, right? Yeah. Because they're seeing you listening, you're identifying the potential issues, because at the end of the day, when you look at extremism, terrorism, gang issues, they really tend to be driven by services. And are different groups benefiting more than others as a result? And it can come down to water or garbage collection or land rights or whatnot. So you have to be analyzing and understanding all of the constituents within a community and have those lines open in order to understand how you can be responsive to those.
Yeah. I'm going to go to Aisha on that. Aisha, I know the museum studies, Holocausts that have occurred in our history, to our species, but the role of the community, the city, the tribe, whatever it happens to be, have you identified for yourself, as Stacia has evidently done, best practices that, again, given the modern scenario, the scenario that we're in with regard to social media and broadband, which we're going to be talking about in our next panel, have begun to look like tools that can be applied to a more stable situation?
I don't know that I have it all figured out, but
oh, darn it.
yeah, you said it was a conversation, so I can just muse, right?
That's right.
What I would say is, I think when I think about communities, cities, whatever that looks like, community means to you, and I talk a lot about community, right? I think you start from the position we're all born free and equal in dignity and in rights. Okay, so we come into the world with these rights that we're born with them. Nobody can take them away. And then you start layering on top of that our history, influence, wherever it may come from, and we create identity. And when we think about communities as having an identity, and we look at communities that feel strong and are thriving, it's no different than human beings. When we feel a sense of identity, who we are, where we're going, who do we want to be, recognizing all of our warts, all of our problems, we thrive. Mm-hmm. We can work through the garbage collection. We can work through, real division in our communities, which many cities have, right? Or amongst groups within. But I think it's, again, that sense of who are we? And I think sometimes about, you go to a big sports event. Many of us haven't been to one for a while, in the way that we might have before. Sports event, a celebration, a wedding, a funeral, all of those places where you kind of know what you're doing there. You're there for a purpose and you're connected to the people around you. There's something that's tying you together. I think that's what communities do. So, at the museum, we talk often about community, bringing community in to learn. We talk about reaching out to community to share their stories. So the museum is dedicated to engaging in dialogue on human rights, but we do that through storytelling. Well, people, sometimes say, well, which community? Well, I don't know. Depends on what we're talking about, right? I am a person of many communities, depending on what it means. But though if you look at it as our cities, as Stacia said, we have within them communities. But at the end of the day, what's our identity? Who do we want to be? Mm-hmm. I think if we can kind of elevate some of our discussion or just personal reflection, because I don't think we should just sit around talking about community, with no purpose either. I think we're stronger. And I think when I see in our work, looking back in history, thinking about contemporary human rights issues, issues of equity, I think that we do best when we can find that common thread to identify around, really.
Yeah.
It can be as basic as respect or dignity. It can be, or it can be far more complex. And I think, to your point, media, it's a way that it's a means of bringing us together, but it's also a means of kind of driving us to question, right? So, Stacia opened with talking about misinformation, disinformation. Right. Yeah, right? It's confusing.
It is. To what degree the social mobility, we've had a type of social mobility over the last, 5 decades, arguably, maybe more, that is unprecedented, with people just picking up and moving. I mean, I'm one of the few people who was raised in a small town, always lived there, had great grounding, moved to New York, never budged, never left. I'm the exception today. I know who I am. I have a pretty strong identity. And most healthy understanding historically seemed to come from a personal place of grounding. You would get that psychological stability. You would have a sense of empathy. You'd have a little bit of armor, but you develop some intelligence based on an educational and spiritual core. But as you say, today, even despite rising affluence, better health outcomes, and all of that, we kind of flounder. And I just wonder, is there a way to bring home everywhere you go? Because this mobility doesn't seem to be slowing down too much. And, to Stacia's point, we're going to have, if we're not careful, 70% of the world's population living in cities that we can barely sustain.
I mean, I think there is a way. I think you have to dig pretty deep about what home is, right? What do we define as home? And when you say, I'm pretty, I don't mean you personally, Blue, but this is who I am. Where did that come from? It came from the people before me. It came from the people around me now. So I think it depends on what we think home is. And so while there's social mobility, I think you absolutely take that with you. But you do have to look inwards and say, what is my core? And it may be kind of ugly, and it may be full of struggle or sadness, or, and you can adjust, right? Like you move, as we become more mobile, we adapt to our circumstances, whether it's increasing wealth or decreasing or education, all those things. But I think at your core, who are you? And I often think, I'm a child of, I'm a first generation Canadian. So I'm a child of immigrants to Canada. So import culture, import religion. And now I'm raising kids blended experience in terms of nationality and race and religion and all of those things that used to be your core. That used to be like, this is who I am, this is who we are, these are our people. People are getting kind of mixed up. And so,
yes,
and it's a good thing. It's beautiful,
right,
but
right. Well,
So,
yeah, no, exactly. Yeah, no, like, my people would say, couldn't you have married a nice Italian girl? Well, no, that's not how the world works anymore.
right. So, but
so,
identity, it's just how we look at it, right? It's like, what are our core beliefs? Who do we want to be as humans? What matters to us? And I think that varies, but at the end of the day, if you carry that, I think that's your tool. I think that's what brings communities together. And you don't have to have the same core belief, but you have to have enough relationship or relatability to say, yeah, at the end of the day, we're all human beings. We all want to live and work and play somewhere where we feel good.
Yeah,
right?
Exactly. And as you say, identify our moral flaws or take a hard look at ourselves, which Stacia, Aisha's kind of saying the 12-step program might apply here to finding our way back home in communities.
You figured it out, Lou.
I figured it out. We have our answer. All right.
Yeah, right.
I mean, I think it can be a really important element of that. It's interesting. One of the things we just finished was a book club. The Carter Center did a book club with a Ebenezer church in Atlanta who had done their own book club and found it so powerful around the book Caste. And incredible book around essentially the caste system in the US, particularly focused on Blacks in the US and their experiences. And it's such a powerful book, but such a powerful experience of creating a forum for us. It was 16 weeks long. We met every other week to go through chapters and just have that reflection, and very diverse participants. But coming to the table and saying, wow, like I'm just thinking about my community differently now, or just who I am in my community, and just being aware, and having those processes. And we actually built a whole new community around this group that we never would have been exposed to normally. Right. That's linked to this church in Atlanta. And we were just talking about how powerful it was to have these conversations with people who are strangers before, but around these issues. And I think there are so many different ways to build community. And I think a lot about, yeah, I mean, I'm home right now in my hometown where I grew up, super small town. Like everyone knew me, everyone knows each other, everyone knows.
Yeah.
Like Insta community. But I think there's some of the work that we've done, that I've done in other places, is how do you actually build that? How do you actually build that sense of community, so that you can have your own identity within it, but what are your common ground? And one of the things that I did in the past, I had a very difficult challenge. I was working in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and they were just finishing demobilization process. And my job was to bring former combatants back to communities, the same communities that they victimized, and help to rebuild the social fabric between all of these members of the community, many who had done harm to others, in order to help move the situation forward there, and a recognition that if these individuals are not reintegrated in some way, shape, or form, that things would get worse. That was incredibly difficult to do, but working with sociologists, community leaders, psychologists, we designed a model that I was like, I don't know if this is going to work. This is pretty difficult. But what they did is, community to community, they designed what they thought their community stood for, what they were going to have as like values as a community. And we did a whole process where we talked about what happened during the war, what people did, like put it out on the table, why people made the choices they made. So we did that whole process to like air it, cleanse it. Doesn't mean that's forgiven, but just acknowledging what happened. And then they moved in a process of, everyone here is exhausted, common theme. Everyone here is exhausted. They've all agreed they want to move forward. So what do you want to be? What do you want to be known for? and each community got together and said, like, here's our values. And they were a little different from community to community, but there are things like, you know, we're going to be hospitable to people who come into our community, or we're all about it, you know, honesty, integrity, whatever they wanted to decide. But they made their, like, this is our community, this is what we stand for. And that type of work is really underestimated in regards to building community. And having some common ground, and sets the north. We talked the other day about, wow, in about how in our community everyone waves at each other, and how that's normal. But it's super weird when you go to other places and like you're waving at people and they're looking at you like you're crazy, right?
That's right.
So, but it's like, okay, well, it's interesting. Why are those norms a little different in those areas? How do we create spaces to make community more welcoming? How is it that I've never talked to my neighbor, and, you know, I've lived in New York, for example, and never talked to my neighbor, you know, so.
But you're right. We don't wave to each other. I wouldn't go out on Second Avenue after we're done here and start waving to people. That could be a problem. But there are ways, to your point, to make people feel comfortable within the context of the community they're in. If I'm hearing you right.
That's exactly it. And thinking about, you know, you talk about like Philadelphia, the city of love, like they're like, that's what we're about. We're about the city of love. It may or may not always reflect that, but you can actually still always bring people back to that. Are we about this? We've said we're about this. What does that look like for us as a community? And use it as a reinforcing mechanism.
Right. Like the sports theme. I just have to ask you about the DRC project just quickly, because I want to move to Aisha as we close. How long did you work there? How long did that take, that process of rebuilding community trust?
You know, I was there for 2.5 years, but our work within communities, within each of the communities, averaged about 8 to 9 months. And the reason why it was, and it's very different from context to context, but the reason why we were able to make as much progress, and it's still holding in the areas. I mean, I still check in the areas where we work and what's happening. And it's remarkable. It's truly still holding now almost 16 years later. But the reason I will say why it did is because everyone was in the same place. They were exhausted. They didn't want to fight anymore. That was their common ground. And then they had agreement on this is how we're going to move forward. This is what we're going to be about. And they co-created that. I mean, that co-creation element is so critical when you're working on it. It's bringing people together and listening and then creating solutions together. And you can't do this top down. It's got to be designed very, very specific to that context. And like, our job is just create the tool, provide the tools, help to facilitate it, but let them take it and run with it. And those are the things we can take away as best practices.
And hope that muscle memory sort of develops, the positive type. That wasn't related to the elections, was it?
Yes, it was.
Okay.
Yes, we were all running up to the first elections in history. So we use that as a common ground of like, we're going to teach you what elections are. We had practice elections in the communities with everyone. They would practice together. Really? They had fake political parties, and they would have fun together. We found, I'll say as a final, one of the things that's really important for building community, particularly if you're trying to address contentious issues, what I've tried to do in my work, you start with something that's not political and not contentious at all. You find the school repair project that everyone cares about. You find you find something that is low hanging fruit and not overly contentious, and it's just going to get people in the same room with each other. And then you can build from there. Right.
It sounds so simple, but it's obviously a lot harder than we think. But thank you for sharing that story, because it just, Aisha, it begs for me to ask you, is there, in the couple of minutes we have, is there a favorite story that you have as a model? Because my belief is, because we see it at ICF, that there's much more hope in the world than you might think, because we see it at the community level. If you want to get reinvigorated with politics, go take a look at some of these city councils and some of these mayors, like Mayor Bowman, and they're terrific. Do you have something like that that you could share?
Oh, I have many
I'm
of
sure.
those stories. So I can't pick one in particular, but I'll tell you this. So lots of the work that I've done to bring people together around a sense of community, spurred from someone who, usually one person, sometimes a group, who felt excluded, unworthy, disrespected, felt that their rights were infringed, their core who they are, right? So whether it was based on race or their ability or disability, their gender, their sexual orientation, all of those things. And in every one of those cases that I think that I can remember, I practiced as a human rights lawyer for years. And so you would try to negotiate something, right? Like, we don't want to go to court on these issues. We don't want to have to, re-victimize someone, a story of sexual harassment or because their gender identity wasn't respected. And it's a difficult line to walk when you have really strong beliefs to try to understand where the other person's coming from, right? Might be a business, might be an individual, whatever it is, but they're the accused versus the victim kind of idea. And I think what I've seen work is allowing people, whether you do it overtly or not, to realize that they just may not know what to do.
Right.
So, the basic human rights principles come from this concept, right? And you think about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, these ideas that every community around the world holds, is that you need not have intent to discriminate or to harm another, like you may not be doing it on purpose. And ignorance, right, is sometimes underlies. And I don't mean education and who has access to it. You just don't know.
Don't know.
And if we, and I know sometimes we can't do it and everyone has their own personal lines, that I'm not going to give it to that person and give them the benefit of the doubt that they didn't know they ought to have known. And there's room for that too, so don't get me wrong. But I think bringing people together, it's building trust, and you build trust when you realize that maybe we don't know.
Right.
And so it just leaves the door open that we can do better. And I think communities have to do that all the time over these issues. And frankly, Stacia, you've been in politics. People just expect you to know everything all the time, right? And yet we elect you to say you're our voice, but then you should know too, and we won't, So it's a whole other game, I'm sure. But I think that's the key. I think is at the, know your core, know who you are, recognize people probably have a pretty similar core. I think I've traveled all over the world and people aren't that different.
No, they really are.
Right? We all kind of want the same thing. So if we start there and leave the door open that we do things to each other, I don't know, right and very much wrong, but there's room to get better. That's the hope. That's what I hold on to, at least.
Aisha Khan, I think that's a great way to end this. I think it's just beautiful. And as you say, sometimes you have to say it. You don't assume that people know it. If you love somebody, you tell them, right? Don't assume. And so I really honor the work that both of you are doing. Stacia, George, continue good luck at the Carter Center in my country. And Aisha, continue good luck at one of the most remarkable places in the world. And if people have never been to the museum in Winnipeg, please go. If you're an architect, it's one of the most beautiful buildings in the world, in addition to being a place that is on sacred ground and has a sacred principle behind it. So listen, I know some of your personal histories today. I know that you made time for us to be here because you were doing other things, and we really appreciate you coming. So thanks again, and we hope to have another conversation in the future.
Thanks for reaching out, and thanks to all of you who are participating today and thinking about these issues. We are a community, we are a community together, and it's all of us working together. There are no easy answers to the work that we're doing. It's all localized. We're all doing the best we can. So also, if anyone has suggestions, I always reach out to me on LinkedIn or whatnot. If you have ideas or want to help us out in the US, reach out to me. But also globally, we're all learning together. And it's an honor to be able to jump in and be a part of your community this afternoon. So thank you.
Thanks, Stacia. You know, I say that all the time, but when you say it, it sounds a lot better. I think they're listening. And if people need to get in touch with both of you, they can do it through us, and obviously
Absolutely.
we'll forward them along. Okay. I should also mention that your discussion really brought out a lot of good ideas and perspectives on the Zoom chat. So the attendees were really listening and sharing ideas as well from communities around the world.
Yeah. Absolutely.
So again, thank you very much, and we'll see you, as I said, in the future.
Excellent.
Thank you, Lou. Thanks, Stacia. See you, everyone.
This series is produced as a service to our network of intelligent communities and movement followers around the world. Special thanks to the ICF Institutes in Dublin, Ohio, and Hsinchu, Taiwan, for their support. Support also comes from the members of the Intelligent Community Forum. Shout out to our series producer, Matt Owen. Hey, if you like this podcast, you can hear a new one every other Monday here at intelligentcommunity.org or on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. And be sure to follow us on Twitter at New Communities and on Facebook. For the Intelligent Community, I'm Lou Zacharilla, reminding you that there really is no place like home. Take care, everybody.